Hello everyone, welcome to the last in a series of webinars we're hosting as part of our annual MethodGrid User Community Symposium. Just a quick message to let you know we are recording this webinar. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Jody. I head up the product team here at MethodGrid. I'm very happy to be joined by Don Moorhouse, our CEO at MethodGrid, and Marc North, one of the senior developers here at MethodGrid. Hello to you both.
Good afternoon, Jody.
Hello.
Before I hand you over to Don, Marc, just a couple of quick bits of information. As I said, this is a series of webinars we've been running. We've had a very interesting webinar from the Oxford Brookes University Estates team showing us how they use MethodGrid to assure complex construction projects. We did a short webinar on the latest feature releases that we've done throughout 2021. We have a consulting company called Future Shift show us how they use MethodGrid for their platform-led consulting to take small and medium-sized businesses through the B Corp certification. MGI Learning shared their experience of the MethodGrid consultants taking them through a MethodGrid implementation. The Step 5 group showed us how they're building out MethodGrid to deliver and assure large-scale transformational projects. I ran through our 2022 product roadmap and feature ideas. Earlier today, EcoSulis rewilding experts took us through ecological rewilding as part of large-scale construction engineering products. And here we are today. If any of those sound interesting, they've all been recorded and you can watch those replays on methodgrid.com/webinars. I'll hand over to Marc and Dom in a moment. If you do have any questions, I'm going to quickly copy in a link to the chat. And if you follow that link, you'll be taken to an application called Slido. And in there, you can post questions just as you think of them. We'll save them all to the end and we'll answer them all at the end. You can also vote up and down those questions. So without further ado, I will hand over to Marc and Dom.
Yeah, thanks, Jody. And just to start with a sort of a bit of an overview as to what we're going to seek to cover in this final session of the series. First, I'm going to just in a moment introduce my colleague Marc, and then we're going to really jump into sort of two key areas. I mean, there are others, and maybe we can kind of mention some of those in the sort of mop-up discussion, but the two we want to really focus on. One is how we see the potential opportunity for machine learning to breathe some much needed life into the old hoary chestnut of managing sort of lessons learned on large kind of delivery portfolios. And then secondly, we're going to talk about how blockchain can be harnessed, particularly with respect to building a sort of inviolable assurance kind of record. So say there are other areas, but these are the two that are probably at the forefront of our kind of R&D activity at the moment. So we'll dive into those. We'll talk about specifically what we're doing in both at a sort of practical level, as in here and now, and then we'll open it up for any wider questions. But before we jump in, as I say, some quick intros. As Jody kindly referenced, I'm one of the 4 co-founders actually of MethodGrid. Originally, I'm the CEO. My background was previously in large-scale transformation work. I had my own sort of management consultancy in that sort of area. And since selling it and moving on from that business, been involved in advisory work to multiple organizations, particularly in that sort of, I guess, SME professional service and project delivery space. Marc, over to you, sir. How would you describe yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Marc. I'm one of the senior developers here at MethodGrid. I'm also currently doing a master's in computer science, focusing on artificial intelligence at the University of Bath. Academically, my background is in maths and computer science, and the work I'm currently doing is going to be essentially what we're talking about today, sort of linking the academic side of things with the work we're doing at MethodGrid.
Great. No, thank you, Marc. So let's jump into the first then topic, which is machine learning, and specifically we're going to talk about, or we're interested in the topic of topic modeling as a subset of machine learning, and specifically with respect to its application to the lessons learned discipline. There are other potential applications, but this is one we are most interested in exploring initially. I think it's fair to say, and I'll ask my colleague Marc to expand on this in a moment, that the sort of construction tech sort of industry is a bit of a laggard actually relative to other sectors with respect to how some of this technologies been taken up. But Mark, over to you. Any sort of further observations on that high level point?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see the quote there, which is from a research article from an engineering journal from last year, that technology adoption in the construction industry is lagging behind these other industries, finance, entertainment, healthcare, education. And the research goes into the reasons why that is the case. And one of the big things it talks about is about the learning curve of new technologies and how construction as an industry has preferred more sort of hands-on methods, and so there's a reluctance to kind of adopt newer technologies, AI of course being one of those things. So there's certainly sort of social aspect to this problem rather than just a technology one. Obviously the technology exists in other industries, but just isn't being used and isn't being experimented with as much in construction. And it's a problem it's a human resources, it's a management problem just as much as it is a technology one. And we need to sort of talk about how, not just how do we develop these technologies, these AI technologies, but how do we actually get people to use them? I think is a very important question. In terms of what's actually going on now, with the academic research and what's being used in industry, the current uses, and there are some very interesting uses, but they tend to be focused on image recognition. So there was a video going around on the internet recently of I think that Boston Dynamics robot dog they have, sort of walking around a construction site, taking videos of what's going on. With that then being analysed to essentially glean the progress of a construction project. Where's what has been built, what hasn't been built, where's everything up to. Without someone manually looking through all of that footage, just having an AI algorithm kind of analyze that automatically. There's also things like activity detection for safety reasons, analyzing, as you can sort of see on the image there on that slide, of is a person wearing the appropriate safety equipment, or is this person wearing a hard hat, a high-vis jacket, and sort of flagging up any health and safety issues that there are on a construction site, either by CCTV or sort of static images that are being taken. Other interesting uses I've seen, I haven't seen any of these actually being used, but they're certainly in the sort of research in an academic context. Things like trying to figure out where structural issues are in buildings based on images. So taking images of, say, cracks in the side of a building and having an AI kind of analyze, is this a big issue? Is this just a cosmetic thing? Things like that, sort of how serious issues are in terms of scheduling evaluations of older buildings, using AI to figure out when someone needs to go in and do an inspection, rather than just having them as, as normally happens of a set thing after, 5-10 years or whatever. So there are certainly some interesting uses. There are some areas being researched, but not as much as in other industries. And I mean, as you can see from that sort of third quote there, that's from a government report, this is really an area that the government are focused on right now. There is a lot of investments from the government in construction, in increasing the use of technology and AI in the construction industry. And a lot of that is focused on data and data integrity. And that's one of the big things that we're going to be talking about.
No, absolutely. And actually, you referenced the roaming dog. I was at the digital construction event in the Excel, in London yesterday, and nearly tripped over it. Actually, they had it wandering around. But to reinforce your third point there, I think it was fair to say there was a real sort of buzz in that arena. I mean, it was essentially hundreds of technology vendors in the construction tech space, and a real sense that there is a sort of shift in this. There was an excellent talk, actually. Nick Smallwood from the IPA gave. He talked about the transforming infrastructure performance roadmap, which is fundamentally an alliance with government and industry to put some rocket fuel on this whole productivity question, and at its core, technological enablement has got to be a component of it. And there's a real sense now, I think, particularly with the government support of funded initiatives now to kind of kickstart some of these really exciting new technologies. So that's the kind of current situation, I guess, generally. But let's look at particularly at lessons learned, and what sort of is the sort of state of play now. And I think anybody that's been involved in large scale project and program delivery will immediately recognise the sort of fairly high level sort of soundbite that's often involved in this kind of this topic. So what it looks like typically, you talk about knowledge, lessons learned capture. Often if it does take place, there'll be a sort of a knowledge manager kind of role that's sort of facilitating. It will typically be the sort of the project leads, and it tends to be a fairly sort of contrived, either end of a project or maybe at the end of a sort of a key stage. There are sort of notable exceptions, sort of peer reviews, independent reviews. I mean, the IPA reviews would be a classic example of that. And then, in terms of the how, what that tends to be is a, textual write-up, often quite a sort of flat, boring, kind of file kind of nature. And, where does it live? It tends to end up on a sort of, organizational SharePoint site, or possibly, a specific lessons learned database, occasionally with meta tagging, but, very rarely. And then in terms of retrieval, probably even less, frequent. If it is done, again, it tends to be a project lead at a sort of inception, mobilization point, but at fairly contrived moments, if at all. Most people would say, look, even the best actually would say, look, we're pretty good at lessons learned capture, but whether there's any kind of reuse value, very, 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 very rare. And again, the retrieval is, often pulling back kind of text-based artifacts. So I guess, apologies for this sort of high-level sweeping generalizations here, but that is probably, a fair portrayal of this sort of center ground, as it were. So this sort of, looking to the future. I mean, before we kind of step to that, I think one thing we do need to recognise is that it's there are some things that will not change, and that is, people engaged in such delivery are invariably, very, very busy professionals, and it's unrealistic to expect, busy professionals, practitioners to sort of change the capacity if they, as it were, or the kind of the behavioural expectations. Rather, technology tools have got to sort of sink into that kind of that backdrop. So I think is a fundamental point as anybody steps into research in this area. But there are some many exciting aspects. You can see a number of them listed at below at the bottom of that slide that are starting to give genuinely new approaches to how even recognizing those behaviors, aspects such as lessons learn loops can be improved. So I guess conceptually, this we'll just give a couple of perspectives here as to how we see this potentially looking, and it kind of frames the hypothesis, as it were, that we are looking to do some more research and development into. And what we're, I guess, keen to explore is that the capture, well, firstly, at a high level, lessons learned can be captured at a number of different places. And firstly, at a real meta level, industry-wide, there's the ability now on a sort of big data perspective to sort of collate and ingest all the sort of best practice artifacts that are out there, particularly, just take the sort of UK context, all the sort of government best practice, a number of obviously professional bodies that contribute to, that sort of wider narrative. So, there's the ability to kind of hoover in all of those kind of artifacts. At a company level, of course, there's the, as organizations, try to do, there's the ability to capture, for busy portfolios, all of the lessons learned that are going on in a particular kind of organization. But I think also increasingly with some of this technology, navigating the sort of the data permissions required, there's the ability to actually, have particularly leading organizations, join in a more collective capture of lessons learned. You know, there might be some anonymization involved in that, but you know, all the leading organizations, you know, certainly AEC companies we're working for are very, very open to the, you know, the wider sectorial sector sort of gain here. So, you know, you can collect this across organizations, obviously with permission. And that specifically on a project, I think, you know, you can open it up to wider, you know, users, or essentially all you know, active members of the project team. And a key bit is that, again, with some of the sort of machine learning that's coming in, you can start to behaviorally nudge people to do this, not at a kind of fairly contrived, you know, we're at the end of a project or the end of a stage, but in the moment of something has been spotted that's just by its nature unique and unusual and potentially bearing of, you know, knowledge value, and essentially nudge a user there and then to capture something very, you know, sort of in the moment, and using all forms, you know, regardless of whether that's a, you know, a written note or a, you know, there's other obviously sort of text artifacts, but probably one of the most powerful for that short, you know, knowledge nugget is the kind of is the use of a video, just to capture that, you know, kind of probably less than 2 minutes in the in the world we live in, you know, where you know, attention spans are sort of necessarily short as well. So, you know, the kind of the how, the who, and the when can sort of certainly be captured in a slightly different way going forward with the right technology. The real then challenge, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mark, is you know, you get all of this information, but you've got to be able to ingest it in a kind of an interesting way for it to be retrievable. But Mark, over to you on this one.
Yeah, sure. So from a sort of technology point of view, just sort of talk about what we mean when we talk about topic modeling. It's a subset of natural language processing, which ultimately is about trying to glean meaning from text and from data. So all of this data that exists out in the world, as Don mentioned, you know, government guidelines that are publicly available, current legislation, internal documents within a company, lessons learned at the end of a previous project, whether that's in video form, as a, you know, PDF or Word document, whatever it is. Fundamentally, the question we're trying to answer is, what are these documents about? And importantly, when you're working on a future project, when are they relevant to what we're doing right now? That's ultimately what we're trying to answer. And I think this is a very important point to make whenever we're talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning, is what do we mean by that, and how is it different from a traditional approach? Because I think oftentimes, you know, these things are used as sort of marketing terms, and they don't really bring anything new to the table. And I think this is the point at which it's important to make that distinction, because what we mean is not just searching in a very sort of traditional, you know, you search for the word, like you're on a construction project, you search for the word bridge, and it just shows you all of the documents that happen to contain the word bridge. That's not intelligence. That's not meaningful. The sort of key point of what we're trying to do here is get all the content that is relevant, not just to specifically the word you have said, but the project you're working on, who you are, what your role is within a project, what stage the project's currently at, the current, you know, government guidelines as they change, anything newer is more relevant, things like that. And it's about answering the question, what are these documents about? How relevant are they to what's going on right now? And one of the big challenges with that is, with all of this different data, is converting it into a form that is meaningful for an AI algorithm. Because a lot of these things, videos, PDFs, PowerPoint presentations, they're written in a form for humans, not for computers. And a sort of big step is getting that meaning from them in a way a computer can understand, can process, and can then give back to you at a relevant moment. And that's sort of the key challenge. There's a lot of ongoing academic research into this. Topic modeling itself is about sort of 20 years old or so as a kind of branch, but there've been huge developments, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, in terms of incorporating sort of deep learning techniques that are more associated with image recognition and bringing that into natural language processing and topic modeling. I mean, I don't know how sort of in depth we want to go with this, but there's anyone interested, there's these things called long short-term memory neural networks, which are a very interesting ongoing area of research, which essentially they remember things rather than just in a traditional AI sense. You give it some input, you get some output. It remembers context. It remembers where you are in a project. It remembers what a document is about. It remembers who you are, and therefore can give you more relevant, in our case, promptings about lessons learned from previous projects. And that's...
Thank you. Mark, I'm going to pull you back there because I know once we set you off on some of this, we can. But you know, I'd say a summary point, you know, with Mark and colleagues, when we get more into this area, is the real heavy lifting will be in this aspect, is how you can ingest, you know, all of those different, you know, kind of artifacts in a way that, you know, renders it such that it's retrievable in a, you know, in an intelligent way. And that, you know, in terms of the actual kind of, you know, where the real depth of the R&D is going to be, it's kind of going to be getting this sort of processing engine, you know, built correctly. And yeah, you know, there's obviously a key kind of ingestion challenge to this. If you know, that is successful, then what you have then is the ability to retrieve lessons learned in a completely unique way as well. And what we again envisage sort of conceptually is that, you know, again, it's not the kind of contrived, you know, with mobilizing a project that's kind of, you know, look at the kind of lessons learned database. It's, again, it's effectively any user of a solution like Method Grid is, you know, essentially able to kind of, you know, access this knowledge. The what is important, because as Mark was touching on there, when you kind of you kind of capture this in the right way, you know, what you're now doing is you're recognizing, well, firstly, what's the role of the individual that's, you know, the particular user in this instance, you know, what's the type of the project, what's the nature of the work, what's the nature of the technical stream within the kind of context of the kind of, you know, the you know, the build, the asset, the infrastructure type. So you've got all that contextual information. You also really importantly, again, in a solution like Method Grid, you have a sense of where are we in this life cycle, you know, what is the you know, where are we now? Take a Reba life cycle approach. You know, what are we doing now? So, you know, this is all about contextually being relevant to the moment. And then, of course, you know, we've got the ability then to play back art, you know, files of different flavors. And I think the video flavor, again, is one that could become increasingly potent. And so, you know, what essentially you're able to do with this new, you know, technology is to get to a point where you're almost curating on, you know, and it can be at an individual level, almost like an individual's kind of YouTube channel analogy, as it were, where, you know, what you can sort of detect is in of the moment, there is something relevant now to this particular kind of thematic, you know, temporal point that we're at, and serve it up, you know, with a sort of big waving metaphorical hand, as it were. To sort of bring that to life a little bit more on a simple slide, you know, this could be Sonia, who's, you know, a contracts manager. She's working on, you know, a rail depot build project. You know, she's at an early stage in the sort of Reba life cycle. You know, she's drafting a contract that's ready. You know, it's her task. You know, the system then is detecting, well, that's where Sonia is on, you know, on her daily to do. You know, triggered in all sorts of ways, what she's viewing, the tasks she's looking at, you know, the video she's just watched, whatever it might be. And essentially the ability, because, you know, in the engine in the background, you know, there's an asset now that is highly relevant to, you know, metaphorically wave a big, you know, big bolt, you know, big hand at Sonia and say, look, we think we've found something that is potentially of high value to you now, contextually now. You know, in this instance could be, you know, another video that's been sort of delivered on this particular topic, and, you know, gives Sonia the ability to, you know, to sort of take that lesson learned, you know, knowledge nugget there and then. And then on the top of that, clearly you kind of always building the sort of the ROI kind of capture here. So, you know, that video served could be as useful, you know, in the early stages as, you know, kind of cat falling off a kind of curtain video on YouTube, you know, absolutely of high irrelevance. Or, you know, alternatively, at the other end of the sort of continuum, that could have saved Sonia and the project, you know, from major rework. And, you know, of course, there's a continuum It could be, well, thank you very much. That was 30 minutes saved today, or thank you very much. That saved me, a good week of work, and the ability now to kind of capture that sort of piece, which is useful in two regards. It's useful from a perspective of its aggregate level. An organization can say, well, this process, this discipline, this solution has saved an aggregate, a person year of work because of this capture, but importantly because it's continuously learning and feeding back into that sort of that database, so that the kind of the knowledge is getting more and more pertinent. Mark, anything to add to that sort of very simplistic case study, as it were?
Yeah, I think what you said at the end is kind of one of the key points about the feedback. Is one of the important points of any machine learning system is it gets better over time. The more data it has, the more it learns, the more it improves, the more relevant, in this case, the recommendations become. And I think that's sort of one of the key distinctions between a machine learning approach to solving this sort of problem and a more traditional one, is it improves over time with more data.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, also involved in this, clearly would have to come out in the research is, the corpus of data has got to be, pretty immense for this to start getting, meaningful and useful. And, hence it does talk to sort of cross-organizational sort of collaboration as well in that regard.
Yeah.
I think we'll leave it there for now. We'll come back if anybody's got any questions in the Q&A, but we're going to cover another block, which is, I've used the word block on the page, another item which we think is very interesting, and again something that's right at the top of our minds with our sort of R&D aspiration. But Mark, over to you for this one.
Yeah, sure. So just to begin, if we sort of talk about what actually is blockchain and what do we mean when we talk about blockchain, I think the use of blockchain people are most familiar with or have heard of is cryptocurrencies. So Bitcoin is one of the sort of most mainstream uses of blockchain currently. And it's not as magical as it sounds, is the first thing to say. Fundamentally, all blockchain is, it's a data storage. It's a system of data storage. But the important point is it's a write-only data storage, meaning you cannot change existing data in a blockchain. If you want to, if we use sort of a method grid example, you create a grid within method grid. If you then want to rename that grid, you don't go in and amend the data that already exists. You add an update operation. If you then want to delete the grid, you add a delete operation. So in order to get a snapshot of where the data currently is, you have to essentially replay all of the data from the beginning to get where you are now. And the important point there is that each of these data blocks, as they're called in blockchain, is linked to the previous blocks. So you cannot go back in time and change something else, either maliciously or otherwise, because it will invalidate all of the preceding data. And that's the important point about blockchain, is it keeps a perfect record of not just where you are now, but how you got there. That's fundamentally what it is. What people usually talk about when they talk about blockchain is this distributed ledger. And what that essentially means is there is not a single data storage. There is not a single data authority. So there isn't one organization who has a data server that keeps track of all this data. It's a distributed ledger, meaning there are different nodes, and in a public ledger, anyone can set up one of these data nodes and they can contribute to this data storage. And there are various different algorithms for how all the different nodes come to a consensus about what should be added to the network. But the idea is this makes the system a lot more resilient. There isn't a single point of failure. There isn't anywhere that any malicious actors can just hack one place and change some data, because that data won't be in the consensus that all the other nodes have come to. So it's a lot more resilient to data loss, to being hacked, to anything like that. And the purpose behind it ultimately is about trust, because to use sort of Bitcoin as an example, because that's the most common one people are familiar with. If you send money online traditionally, you need a trusted third party. in order for you to know I have the money I'm saying I have, your bank has to ask my bank to check my bank account. And that system works because we both trust our banks. And blockchain distributed ledgers are essentially trying to eliminate the need for that trusted third party. We can now trust each other. We can verify that I have the money I'm claiming I have because it's on the blockchain and that's publicly available. And it's publicly, we've come to a consensus about what the data is. Again, that works for financial transactions. There's also uses for things like what are being called smart contracts, again, which are contracts that remove this need for a trusted third party. So why is this relevant to assurance? And I think the important question whenever we're talking about new technology generally, and especially things like blockchain, is why is it better than what we were doing before? Why use blockchain as your data store instead of a traditional database? And for a lot of applications, the answer is there isn't really a reason to use it. It generally is going to be slower, it's going to use more data, it's difficult to maintain. So why use it? And the reason we think this is going to be a huge area for assurance specifically is because of data integrity. It is very, very important in assurance for data integrity. Similarly, in financial transactions, data integrity is very, very important. That's why one of the big early uses of blockchain is in financial transactions, because of how important data integrity is. As you can see that quote there from the government report on Grenfell, essentially directly attributes failings to poor auditing and data integrity. And going back to what I was saying before about how blockchain works, it's about auditing is built into the data store. You don't need to have a separate storage of your current project plan and then a separate auditing of how you got there. With a blockchain data store, that auditing is built in because that's how they are saved. Fundamentally, you have an immutable, guaranteed to be accurate audit trail of your project and how you got there. And this is where we think assurance is going to be going, and this is where we are. This is where we are, the direction we're pushing things in, essentially. So just talk about briefly what we are doing and where we think things are going. Long term, we think where the industry is moving is into, similar to sort of cryptocurrencies, public distributed ledger of auditable data. We think this is where things are moving. And that is a huge industry-wide effort that is going to get us there. It's going to involve construction companies. It's going to involve technology firms such as ourselves. It's going to involve government. It's going to involve regulatory bodies. It's going to involve academics. And I mean, I think we're looking at sort of 10, 15 years. This is where things are going to be moving. Short term, it's kind of interesting when you read about research into blockchain, because the comparison that is often made is with the early days of the internet. And in the early days of the internet, a lot of technology innovation and a lot of experimentation was focused on internal systems. So within a company or within a smaller group of companies within an industry, or on closed networks like AOL had in the early days of the internet. And a lot of research currently being done is focused on those sort of closed distributed ledger blockchain systems. And the thinking is that for the next 5 years or so, that's where the focus is going to be. But then long term, the focus is on this public distributed ledger blockchains. And our thinking is to develop those things internally currently on those private networks, converting our own data stores to this private blockchain system, building up that infrastructure and that technology, always bearing in mind that the long-term goal is this industry-wide transformation of how project data is stored and audited in collaboration with, regulatory bodies, auditors, government, etc., etc.
Great stuff. Thank you, Mark. So just to sort of get to the here and now where we are at Methagrid, I guess, for these two areas, and then we can maybe talk about some others. On the topic modelling front, we are actually in the midst of putting together some bids, and probably the kind of one that's most interesting is the sort of UK Innovate smart grants, and that's a combination of ourselves as the sort of the prime, as it were, and the technology vendor at the sort of heart of it. We're looking to work here in this instance with Bath University. We're pretty fortunate, actually. Geographically, our HQ is in the city of Bath. That happens to be one of the finest computer science faculties there, particularly in the sort of data analytic kind of sphere. Mark, you probably picked up from his accent, is not from Bath, but is doing his master's at Bath University. So that's tied up really well with Mark, actually one of our lead developers as well. So it's been a nice kind of confluence of circumstance there. And of course, really, really critically is to take with us, a handful of leading forward thinking, firms in the sector. And we're tied now with, we probably only have room for sort of, most six really. We don't want to make it too big a group, but we're tied up now with a number of leading sort of AEC engineering consulting firms to sort of pilot, some of this. There's still room actually for one or two others, but that's the kind of size of the group. If of interest in you watching this as now or as a recording, please get in touch if this is something of professional interest to you as well. So the idea is to sort of get that consortium off and running in the new year, and we're sort of targeting a sort of a Q1 start. And we sort of envisaged the piece of work being roughly a 12-month project to really look at this in some kind of focused detail for, as I say, 12 months to come out of that exercise with a sense of, hopefully a number of learns, clearly on our selfish side, that we have a better understanding of what the technology might be that sits behind it. But, collectively, we all get a view as to where this could go and whether it genuinely could help with respect to that, as I say, particularly the lessons learned topic. So that's probably the one that's right at the forefront. I guess just abound behind it is this whole look at how blockchain may secure the assurance record. How we might use it to, for our clients when they go through a gate, stage gate, we can sort of snapshot all the files that existed at that sort of key decision point and sort of secure it with a with a blockchain technology. I think in this one, essentially, it's kind of really us staying a little bit closer to where some of the legislation's going. We've got a good relationship with Manchester University, particularly. There's a Professor Richard Kirkham, I know, and his colleagues are doing some really interesting work in this regard. So essentially staying close to, to that academic body. But I absolutely envisage in 2022 we'll be kicking off something more meaningful in terms of R&D in this space here. I guess the final bit I would say just before we open up for questions is a more sort of I guess high level theme for us is we uniquely are capturing knowledge and resource that that is being used on project teams. Simply put, it's an amalgam of a knowledge management solution with a project and an assurance solution. So when you combine knowledge artifacts and everything that's been used on a project with the sort of project efficacy outcome, those two data pools can be brought together in really interesting ways. I'm not going to overreach here because it's only in very recent time that we've started to bring those data sets together, but we see ourselves having the opportunity in the months and years to come that, particularly with organizations with large portfolios, we can see what templates and resources they're using, what compliance regime effectively they have, and we'll also sort of be able to build increasingly a sense of what the productivity was on that project, what kind of benefits and schedule kind of outcomes were delivered. And when you join up those two kind of data pools with inferential logic, again we see the ability to do some really interesting stuff there. yeah, that's the sort of high level kind of capture of it, and it's probably bound behind these two themes here, but something that, again, that we see ourselves getting involved in. I'm going to pause there. We'll go over, Jodie. I think I'm going to hand you back to you to facilitate Q&A if there are any
thanks
questions.
very much. So I'm just going to skip it forward to the slide with the URL in there. I'll post it in the chat again. We do have a few questions. So in the chat, you've got the link there to the system you can post questions in. But we've got a few come in, so I'll kick off. And the first one, which is pretty succinct, is what's the difference between machine learning and AI?
Definitely going to throw that one to Mark initially.
Difference between machine learning and AI. So machine learning is sort of a subset of AI. So everything that is machine learning is also artificial intelligence, but not necessarily the other way around. And the kind of key defining feature of machine learning is the word learning. The more data you give a machine learning algorithm, the better it gets. So to sort of link it back to, what we were talking about earlier with the sort of lessons learned, the more documents that this algorithm processes, the better it gets. The more feedback it gets from users, the better it gets. The more accurate its document categorizations get, the more accurate its suggestions get, and that's sort of the key feature of machine learning. You can have AI, any system that attempts to make intelligent decisions can be thought of as AI, but yeah, if it's not learning from new data, if it's not getting better over time, it would just be sort of AI as opposed to machine learning. That's sort of the key distinction.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. Okay, I'll just highlight another question here. So can machine learning help with other aspects of project delivery over and above lessons learned?
Just to start on that, and Mark, again, I'll be interested in your take on this particular question, but absolutely yes. Is a simple answer. And another aspect, I know a number of people are, some very capable minds are starting to address is the, for example, the sort of the scheduling, challenge when you are, scheduling, activities on projects that have by their nature, repeatable natures. You can increasingly learn what is realistic, right down to a very, very granular sort of activity level. And again, the more contextual, the better. When I do this kind of construction activity on this type of project, with these other variables, we should be able to sort of deliver it in, X days. And I'd imagine that kind of aspect, schedule forecasting improvement, Mark, is an obvious one for a sort of machine learning play as well.
Yeah, I'd certainly say so. I think, one of the things that AI algorithms are very, very good at is pattern recognition. And I think that sort of fits into that sort of area. If you give it a bunch of inputs, as you say, sort of project parameters, essentially, what is it you're doing? What's your budget? What are your resources? How many people are working on it? Things like that, and it then intelligently sort of predicting would be the sort of AI language you'd use, predicting how long it's going to take. Anomaly detection is the other one of within a project, predicting when things are going to overrun based on all these parameters and based on like deadlines and things, detecting anomalies. So in similar projects, this is how long these things took. Your deadline is here. That doesn't fit the pattern of what's happened previously, and flagging things up like that. I think, I think it's a good area for that.
I think the build on that would, be potentially, in how it would be involved in risk management, more broadly. Again, it sort of pattern detects that something's coming up, it's seen before, and this kind of risk is becoming increasingly manifest. And again, behaviorally nudging people to be aware that there's a maybe a blindside risk coming in that's not being captured.
Yeah, whether that thing's sort of overrunning in terms of time or in terms of budget, any sort of anomaly of this doesn't fit the pattern of what's happened on other similar projects, I think is absolutely the sort of thing that AI can do.
Great, thanks, guys. Got a new question coming, which I will move up actually. So, what is the risk of AI moving away from prescribed processes and/or regulatory compliance?
Well, I guess, I mean, again, Mark, I'm interested in your take, but at one simple level, I think, machine learning AI is on one level intelligent, on another level completely dumb. So it doesn't necessarily know that it's, and I guess this is the nature of the question. It doesn't know it's off of a regulatory practice per se. So I guess that there is an onus on solutions such as ours to sort of make it clear there is a variance, but and I guess this is part of the research, Mark. Yeah, is that you in some ways you're just stochastically playing back. Here we've spotted something we think is very relevant, but what you don't necessarily know is it's kind of off something that somebody over here, regulators, saying you've got to do it this way.
Yeah, and that's sort of one of the challenges with AI generally in any area is sort of referred to the black box problem of AI. Of you can give it some inputs, it will give you an answer, and the sort of question of how did it arrive at that answer. And I think that's sort of what you're sort of speaking to, of why is it giving me this recommendation? Why is it giving me this? Why has it made this decision it's made? And it's an active area of research to sort of explain why AI systems make the decisions they make, and sort of feeding that back to the people using it so that they can make decisions and incorporate the AI's sort of output into their own decision making. I think there's a lot of sort of interesting legal questions that sort of come out of that, the decisions that have been made. And I certainly think, I just say it's sort of important to, when we're developing these sort of systems, to make it clear where these recommendations, where these decisions have come from, and kind of prompting the user of, this is why we're saying this to you, this is what our system has done, here's all the information you need to make that decision, kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I think source attribution of anything you play back is going to be key. But also, maybe we didn't mention it so much, but again, you have to have this significant corpus of knowledge for it to be for it to have the ability to learn. But a key part of that has got to be the ingestion of all of the regulatory best practice, and there might be some human filter needed on that curation, possibly, to make sure that it is the kind of the most contemporary best practice. But you would like to think with that aspect well done, the sort of skew in the playback would be that it's reinforcing best practice as opposed to kind of going off on a complete tangent to it. But yeah, I think it's a great question, because for me, that's probably one of the key things that the research needs to track.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in any AI application, data quality is absolutely the most important thing. Your algorithm and the answers you get are only as good as the data you're giving it to learn from. So that absolutely is something that is vital to have quality data that it's learning from.
But also the feedback loop to quickly filter out the garbage as it starts to kick in.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I hope that answered the question. If it didn't, feel free to post a follow-up one. We've got one left, unless anyone's got any more. So quite pertinent. How far are we from this being a usable reality, do we think?
I mean, I'll have a first go, and again, Mark, that is a really almost unanswerable question. And I think you step into any R&D, innovation of this kind of ilk, you do genuinely do so with the kind of the risk that it could go, in very, very different directions. One of which is, frankly, nowhere, and or we're not quite ready for this now. But I think with a much more optimistic demeanor, Mark, you and I were chatting about this earlier. If a piece of research that the project we've just described, for example, if that kind of went, broadly along the lines we envisage, actually, and I know this is the way the sort of, Jody, you and the dev team work at MetaGrid, we're very, very agile in terms of moving conceptual ideas to, practical product. You'd like to think with all the learns that come from a project like this, I'm talking specifically about the machine learning lessons learned engine, that the first, meaningful manifestation of that, I would like to think, a couple of quarters after a project. So maybe, 18 months in total, if the research landed on successful application, that it would be probably 18 months away. I mean, again, it's not going to be the full shebang overnight, but you'd like to sort of think that the first, the first related products of that solution set would be in sight in that kind of period of time. But Mark, Jody, you what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of technology, it's I sort of feel like it's one of those things of it's an idea whose time has come, there's sort of a confluence of different factors of, government investment, of the industry sort of being in a good place and ready for it, academic research being in a good place to support these sort of things. And if you look at the sort of academic literature, there's certainly good, not quite sort of a proof of concept in a product sense, but in terms of research suggesting that this sort of thing can work. There are sort of topic modeling research being done into very specific corpuses of documents, but that do yield some good results to meaningfully categorize these sorts of things. So I think, like I say, I think it's it's always a possibility of any sort of research. You sort of get into it and go, okay, we're not quite there yet in terms of technology. But I honestly do think it's, like I say, an idea whose time has come, and I'm fairly optimistic about it from a technology point of view, at least.
Yeah, great. I'll hold you guys to that.
Okay, that was our last question. I will hold the floor for just a moment in case anyone's got another one. So just follow that link and you can post one in there. All these webinars will be available to watch on demand. There's a video replay at methodgrid.com/webinars. So there's another 7 prior to this. And of course, if any of your colleagues would be interested in this talk, then send them to methodgrid.com/webinars and they can find the replay there. So it looks like we've got no further questions. So it probably remains for me to say thanks, Dom and Mark. And
Jody, and before you close down, I'm also, because I know this is the last in your series this year, just going to publicly record a huge thanks to you, because Jody is our Chief Product Officer and has brought together this year's User Symposium. And as anybody who's done something similar will be aware, a huge amount of work, just collating all of the content, collating the speakers, collating the the materials that go into it. And I know, Jody, you've done a huge amount of work to bring this year's series together. So huge thanks to you, Jody, as well, as we close down.
Thanks very much, and a huge thanks to everyone who's joined us for these talks. Every single one's been really interesting. Okay, well, thanks everyone. I'm going to close down, and thanks for coming, and thanks for talking, Mark and Don.